Hello and welcome to another episode of the Manhood Simplified podcast, where once again, we're going to make what I call really an attempt at understanding what it means to be a man in this country and what masculinity ought to look like in order for us to build the kind of world we'd envisioned. Today, we're hoping to hone in on issues around sexual assault, what it means to be a male survivor, and what healing perhaps needs to take place amongst men if we are to get to the bottom of solving issues to do with masculinity. Always great to be with you. I'm Amanda Nyati.
And my name is Kameli Shepovana. Yes, it is a very beautiful name. I'm well aware of that. And helping us to rewrite this page of the Manual of Manhood, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our guests. First, Mr. Martin Pelders, author, or should I say the head honcho of Matrix Men South Africa, as well as Dr. Malose Langa, author of the book Becoming Men. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. Please take a moment, if you would, to briefly introduce yourselves and the work that you do.
Thank you. My name is Martin Pelders. I'm the founder of Matrix Men, life coach, recovery coach, and just a man who raises awareness about sexually abused men.
I'm Malose Langa, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Wits University and a senior researcher at Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And I'm doing a lot of research around meanings of boyhood, manhood in South Africa.
And perhaps that's a great place to start, shall we? I mean, we've been struggling to even define what manhood actually looks like. You spend your days, I guess, worming through that question. If you were to be asked that question, I mean, what does it mean to be a man and a boy, perhaps in the South African context? What's your response?
Thanks, Ayanda. And normally, when I ask men or boys, to say, what does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a man? The first answer that I normally get is that of a giggle.
Right.
And a giggle which I guess it highlights something that you're asking me an obvious question. A question that I've not made time to think it through. And often, some will even go far as sort of standing up and saying, are you serious? Are you serious that you're asking me what does it mean to be a boy, to be a man? And I guess for me, that bodily reaction, it is quite telling that it is not easy for boys and men to define what it means to be a boy or a man. But then when I try and analyze that, is that no one is born a man, no one is born a woman. And the process of becoming a man and the process of becoming a boy, like I've said in my book, it is something that is quite violent, and I'll explain more in details at a later stage.
Right.
But basically, the simple definition is that there's a social construct of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a man. And it's how boys and men are expected to sort of behave. And that process of the expectation that one has to be in this way, one has to behave in this way, it alienates boys and men from their own humanity. So basically the simple definition of boyhood, manhood, is what the society is expecting of you, that you need to behave in this way. You need to be strong, you need to be tough, you need to be this, you need to be this, you need to be this. And once you are not behaving in that way, your manhood, your boyhood becomes questioned.
As far as our inability to sing on the same hymn sheet, as far as this definition of boyhood and manhood and how we understand those two things to be, is this part and parcel of the problem in society where so many differing definitions and understandings of the terms are clashing with each other and no one seems to be able to make up their mind on it? And how does that further make the landscape even more foggy as far as trying to understand this? Martin, I think you can also toss your opinion in on this one as well.
Yeah, I think that, there's a huge focus on boys and men, but I was just, as we're talking, I'm thinking, but there's people get offended when we talk about toxic masculinity, right? I mean, a lot of men get really angry with you.
Close off, in fact.
Yeah, they close off. And it's like you're attacking masculinity. And no, we're not. We're actually trying to eliminate the toxicity of masculinity. The fact that you need to use aggression to solve your problems, that you can go and drown your sorrows in alcohol and all that sort of stuff. But we're always genderizing everything, because I'm thinking now that I'm sitting and thinking about this toxic femininity as well. You know, where all women are nurturing, all women are caring and loving, and they're not. They're quite simply not. Some women just don't want to have children, but society pressurizes them into having children. Or they don't want to get married, but society pressurizes them. So I think the problem is societal precepts. And we kind of need to start looking at those and say, listen, you know, why can't we just let people develop as they develop?
Right.
You know, I mean, I'm looking at my young nephew and my son, who's now a year and a half, and you don't need to, you know, my son is like a rugby player, and nobody's taught him that. You know, I mean, he hits into his high chair and starts pushing it across the house. You know, he does that, whereas my daughter was totally different. You know, I don't need to teach him to be an aggressive young boy. He just has that natural strength, that natural drive to be masculine. You know, and we need to stop forcing our opinions and our ideals on children. We need to just let them develop as they develop, and they will just turn out to what they're supposed to develop into, I believe.
Yeah, Dr. Langa, I see you're thinking deeply about this.
I mean, obviously, I mean, going back to the question, and hence, once upon a time, you know, I guess the term like, you know, masculinity was sort of like, you know, used and sort of like, you know, defined. But as we went along, it was like, look, I mean, it is quite inhibiting, because when you say masculinity, basically it's like, you know, something quite singular, okay, and hence then it was like, you know, agreed, I guess, in the literature, you know, to say masculinities, and with the use of like, you know, masculinities is that the different ways of being a boy, the different ways of being a man, and obviously this will differ in terms of class, race, age, the context, and many other sort of like, you know, factors. But also with that, it was an acknowledgement that the notion of like, you know, manhood, it is quite unstable. The notion of like, you know, boyhood, it is quite fluid. It moves, it changes, and hence it becomes like, you know, quite messy, like, you know, in a way. But also that has offered us like a rich tool that one man can be like, you know, many things. You can be like a good football player. You could be like a bad lover. You could be a good cooker. You could be like, you know, so many things. But also here it's about how then do you reconcile, I guess, like, you know, some of this like, you know, tensions. In your sense of like, you know, sort of like, you know, manhood.
Which is a good way to segue into what else I was hoping to unpack. I mean, if men can occupy these different positionalities, it should be easy for us to think of men as being survivors of sexual violence, right? I mean, surely that exists somewhere on the spectrum. Reality, though, is that stereotypically speaking, that isn't wrapped around the head, dare I even say, of sometimes even male survivors themselves, because of the socialization, I should say, that we've all been the recipients of. I mean, is that strange to you? Is that something that you've noted, something that's come up in your work?
Totally. I mean, let's look at some famous male survivors of sexual abuse, right? Sugar Ray Leonard, Mike Tyson, right? Tyler Perry. I mean, when you look at these people in the terms of masculinity, our precepts of masculinity, you're going to look at them and say, well, these are men's men, you know? I mean, if you look at somebody like The Rock, who's a bigger man? The Rock, I mean, not in terms of size, but I mean in terms of character, or the man who, and his name eludes me now, I've been trying to think of it all the time.
Terry Crews?
No, the guy that the ultra-distance runner who broke the... you know, who ran the mile, the marathon in 21 minutes or something like that.
Okay.
I mean, you look at The Rock, who's a giant of a man, and then you look at this guy who's short. He's like 5'5", yet he runs at an average speed of like 21 kilometers an hour. I mean, I can't even cycle that fast. You know what I mean? And so who's the stronger man? The Rock, who bench presses like my body weight, or more, or this guy. So we need to change those kids. So, in terms of male victims of sexual abuse, I mean, you look at those three names that I've just mentioned, and these are all perceived to be men's men. And how long did it take them to finally come out and talk about the fact that they were sexually abused? They were all well into their 30s, 40s, even 50s in terms of, Sugar Ray Leonard was in his 50s. He was retired from boxing before he started talking about what happened to him. We've just had the ex-Manchester player, again, names elude me.
We'll find them in the edits.
Yeah, it's he's just come out. Patrice Evra, yeah, that's right. He's just come out. He's also a survivor of sexual abuse.
Why do you think it takes so long? I mean, because I imagine this is what you're getting at, right? There's something that prevents these men.
Society.
Right.
Society doesn't give men permission to talk about it. We currently focused on female victims. When we talk GBV, I mean, it's gender, which is a neutral term for male and female these days. 260 odd different genders, right? So it's a neutral term, but the minute you put based violence behind it, it changes the meaning of the word for 99% of the population. Suddenly we're talking about women, we're talking about girls. We're not talking about gender, we're not talking about everybody. We were chatting before we started that when you walk into a rape crisis center, guarantee you 99.999% of all the posters on the wall are going to depict a male perpetrator and a female victim. And when I walked into a rape crisis center as a 16-year-old boy, looking to talk about, finally plucked up the courage to talk about it, that very picture turned me off and I ran away. And then I went and poured myself into alcohol, sex, drugs, for the next 30 years of my life before I heard other men talking about it. And that gave me permission to start my healing process.
Just to latch onto that, Martin, I think I'd like to posit the question of whether or not a lack of access to the vocab and access to the kind of language you need to find to be able to communicate these instances of being sexually abused, like you just referred to. I wonder if that could also be one of the issues that plague men from speaking out in these instances. What would you say are the difficulties that men face as far as accessing this dialogue, accessing this vocabulary, this language, and how do we go about undoing all of that?
Well, it starts with children. It starts with parents, I mean, I sit down and I do this often. I go to men and I say, give me words for emotions. And the average that men come up with is about 7 or 8 words. I sit down with women and I say, give me different words for emotions. Ah, man, a week later, they'll still be busy rattling off different things, And when they see me in a month's time, they'll go, oh, and I thought about this or this or this or this. So I always say men have been given 5 tools to cope with trauma in their lives, right? Aggression or violence, right? Sex, right? Alcohol, drugs, or pornography. I mean, that's it, We're not given the emotional vocab, right? To be able to talk about what's happening, how we're feeling. We're not taught these things. In fact, when a little boy falls down, scrapes his knee, and there's blood pouring out of his knee, and all he wants is a little comfort and empathy from his parents, what's he told? Don't be such a baby. Big boys don't cry. You're such a girl. Things like that. So why are we treating our children differently? Like I say, I come back to the example of my son. He can't even speak yet. He's like pushing high chairs around the house. You know what I mean? It's just, he's a boy, and he's totally different to my daughter. She's a girl. She likes to sit there and play with dolls. And, my boy has the same access to dolls. He doesn't want to play with them. He wants to play with trucks. He wants to bench press things. He wants to break windows.
I do wonder whether your response to your kids would have been different had the roles been around. I mean, it's difficult to hypothesize, right? Because we're in a context where it just so happens, I guess, where people are most likely not to frown at your son because, that's our thinking around what boys should be getting up to. But it does bring us, Dr. Langa, back into the question around what becoming men actually looks like. And, the journey that is typically followed in getting to that place. I wonder, though, whether we could speak about, let's say, decoding toxic masculinity without taking in what misogyny looks like. right, without actually speaking about whether or not we are being honest about ways through which even men in the spaces that we frequent still espouse misogynistic characteristic, misogynistic sentiment.
I mean, obviously, there's something about, like, masculinities, to say it's relational in character. And where we need to decode it is for it to exist independently. When I say relational, it means it always compares itself. It can't exist on its own. And then it says something about where even in the pursuit of like manhood, you never sort of like arrive. It's an illusion. It becomes
Unattainable goal.
yes. It's this, and then you think like you have arrived. What you've done today is not good enough for tomorrow. Tomorrow you still need to perform. But if and the only real way for it to be decoded is to get to a point where I no longer need to like aspire, okay? And there is like an internal, so obviously you revert back to the self. But when you revert back to the self, the whole society is looking at you, because once upon a time you're being told, say, like Martin is saying, be quite expressive, okay? And there's been that like talk, and then it's like, okay, we need to find like a label like around metrosexual sort of like man. Of course, it comes with like some costs, where it's like, okay, we don't want men that are dead like emotionally, and then you start like expressing, and then it's like, no, you're expressing too much, okay, and hold sort of like your horses, and then you're pushed to be sort of like in the middle, and then when you're in the middle, obviously there's always this sort of like conflict. And the part that I want to bring in is like around, there's no way we can liberate like men without liberating like women. Meaning, all of us need to be liberated. Because in my private space where I do a lot of psychotherapy work, I hear a lot of men saying, look, I'm trying my level best to be like a good man. And I'm saying good man with inverted sort of like commas. But in my attempt to be like a good man, a good father, to be present for my child, I'm being told to say, you need to be out there and be with like other guys. But when I'm out there, it's like you're not spending time with your child. All these like contradictions, they get to a point where men say, I don't know what is that I need to do, to sort of like arrive. And it comes with like such an emotional pain, to a point where I'm saying a lot gets said, to say men need to change, and then I'm like, okay, do we need to develop a sort of like a list of what does this like change like entail,
or a scale of this
like,
change to determine how much change they'd like to see these men make.
And of course, immediately when you do that, where and you see it, you will see it in a lot of books. To say these are the key characteristics of what it means to be like a good man. Okay, but you always wonder about, are these really attainable, and whose standard is this? Can this standard be applicable, to all men, irrespective of class, irrespective of race, irrespective of gender, and irrespective of, I guess, even the location where they sort of like live?
I'm curious as far as everything that you've had to say about men trying their level best and trying their level best in a climate where none of their efforts seem to be good enough. I want to find out your insight, both of your insight, on the matter of what the women we're meant to be protecting, what the women we're meant to be nurturing and honoring, the role they have to play in the confusion and the mess that we've referred to earlier. You mentioned the instances where where men feel like they're trying hard in this sector, but in doing so, they sacrifice trying hard in another sector. And this question of what does, I'm thinking about things like sexual harassment, sexual assault, what does and what doesn't constitute sexual assault, and how the conversation that women have on that matter and the contradictory messages that they offer to that serve to further enhance the messiness of the situation. What role do they have to play in causing this this mess, and how do we go about exactly and clarifying exactly what is and what isn't inappropriate behavior towards those of the fairer sex, quote unquote?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'll rely on my experience, having served in a lot of cases around sexual harassment, where and I guess without even disclosing details of some of the cases, where and here I'll talk about students sort of mainly because I'm based at the university. And then it would be okay, there's this event as we're sitting here and chit-chatting. And of course, there are comments that get made. Okay, pass me a coffee, you this and this and this. Okay, the comment is made in that context. And in fact, there's also sort of laughter. Okay, and someone I guess, put your hand, somewhere where the other may felt that the hand was put, inappropriately. Okay? And then later, allegations then begin to sort of arise. And I remember this case in particular where the student, who was a male student, said, but comrade, this is how we always sort of spoke. Okay? To say in this space, sort of anything was allowed to be said, okay, and a lot of examples were sort of given, okay, and then when I heard what was being said, I did feel as an outsider, I did feel that was inappropriate, but when we called, I guess sort of witnesses, to say, can you confirm the language, to say this is the language that is being used, in the space. A lot of witnesses, confirmed, to say, that's how we'll normally sort of talk, okay? And then for me, and then I begin to sort of question, to say, can we be consistent? To say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we are sitting here, we need to call that out, to say, you can't. And if you can't, you can't. It can be said, at this moment it is appropriate, at this moment it is not appropriate, because then it creates a confusion. It does. That even when we talk about, sort of GBV, sexual harassment, we sit on our couches, be at 8 o'clock, okay? And we watch a lot of soapies, okay? And when we watch them, it's sort of our guards at that time, they have to be down. Everything is more acceptable. We can watch Generation, we can watch Isibaya, and you can watch all this soapies. But there are a lot of problematic discourses that get perpetuated, okay? Yeah. But at that time, no one will say anything. Until something sort of happens. We're all carrying placards. Hashtag this, hashtag this, hashtag this. But I'm saying we've been quite complicit in a lot of instances which we should have been very consistent. And I think that would be my contribution to say we need to be consistent and be consistent.
Yeah.
It's fascinating what you're saying. I don't know if you want to chime in there.
There's something we were talking about universities and harassment, and I just thought of a study by the CDC in the USA. They went to 12 colleges in the USA, and colleges are perceived to be these spaces where girls are raped and boys are just sexually harassing them and everything. And they went to 12 colleges, and the comeback from that is the majority of boys in all but 2 of the colleges were victimized.
In what sense?
Sexually harassed or raped. So it's the weird thing, but we don't want to, as society told us, but we're sexual beings, men are sexual beings, and that, if we have sex, no matter what the circumstance, we're supposed to be happy. So when your 40-year-old maths teacher rapes a little 12-year-old boy, well, he's lucky. You know, he's scored. You know, wow, he's such a man.
Right.
You know, but the fact of the matter is that 12-year-old boy was not ready for that interaction. And in fact, research has told us, in South Africa in particular, that the majority of boys are raped by women and not men. So it's quite sad that we only focus in, we're turning this into a gender issue when it's a human problem, you know? And then if we look at boys and we go back to, boys are a product of how they are raised, right? So what you see and what you experience most in your lifetime is what you're going to emulate or become, right? Like you say, we're not given the opportunity to flourish and become who we are supposed to be. Society conforms us into a specific channel, right? So we look at the things like, I was told that when I'm 25, I'm going to buy a house, and well, I'm going to get married, buy a house, have 2 cars, a dog, and 2 children, and then I'm going to be happy. The fact of the matter is I had all of that and I was deeply unhappy. I woke up every day wanting to kill myself, right? I woke up every morning going, I wish I was dead.
Right.
So what's the point? I suffered major depression, and that's a product of my upbringing, right?
Yeah.
I am a product of what happened to me as a child. So we need to start changing these things. We need to stop trying to enforce what we perceive to be masculinity or femininity on children and just let them develop into who they're supposed to be.
Your lived experiences, I guess, drawing into sharp focus, questions around how men, given our socializations, respond to trauma. And I wonder whether or not we've come any close to being able to, at the very least, understand that and place its contribution to what we now commonly refer to as toxic masculinity. Let me begin with you, Martin. I mean, because you've spoken a lot about your own personal experience. At the time when you were grappling with these difficulties, did you feel equipped to?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
No, definitely not.
And where do the gaps lie, I guess, becomes the secondary question.
Well, you know, I mean, it just becomes, you know, for me, I mean, I couldn't go to my home to talk about the things that were happening to me because those things were happening in my home.
Right.
You know, so I couldn't turn around to my dad and say, hey, mom's beating me, you know, because he would like, why, you know? I mean, so I didn't have the ability to go to those closest to me to seek help. At school, because, you know, we know from research that boys who've suffered major trauma in their lives grow up and display the symptoms of ADHD. You know, so we're very dissociated and we're very sort of scatterbrained and all that sort of stuff. So at school, I wasn't very attentive to my schoolwork. I was called dumb. I was labeled as stupid or lazy. You know, so all of these things. So it starts right from there and goes through. Teachers don't have the knowledge to be able to point these things out. A lot of doctors don't have the experience to point these things out. I mean, I can carry on. The entire society just doesn't have the ability. I mean, a man walks into a police station and says, I've been raped. What do you think is going to happen to him?
Most of the time. Huh?
Yeah, he's going to get laughed at. And they go, well, did you enjoy it? You know, he says, well, actually, I was gang raped by 5 men anally. No, I didn't enjoy it. But he doesn't have the ability to say that. He's in shock. He's in trauma. He wants to go and do what he feels is right, yet society is not equipped to deal with it. So it's a huge problem that begins in the home. And we need to start re-educating parents. We need to start re-educating teachers. We need to start re-educating doctors. We need to start I mean, I can guarantee you a majority of doctors do not know that more boys are sexually abused in this country than girls. Guaranteed. Even the 2 research projects that glaringly state the obvious. Yet we ignored it. One was presented in Parliament in 2008. It was ignored, right? Because we were looking for a link between the spread of HIV/AIDS and sexual abuse. Right? Parliament ignored it. Well, we had AIDS denialism in those days. It was like, take some garlic and have a few madumbis and it'll sort it out, right? So we all have our problems. Yet it was ignored. It is still today ignored. I mean, for years, I went from like talking about my experience to getting to a point where I said, all I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the research that has been done. You can't argue with research, right? And and when I point it out, and I say to people, but research tells us, eventually they get to the point, you and your research.
Yeah. What else do we rely on if not that, right?
We can't.
I mean, Dr. Langa, your response to this question around trauma and men internalizing, responding to trauma.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you look at the history of, I'll say PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, interestingly, in terms of its history, of course it arose out of studies that were done with war veterans in the US. And of course it becomes a diagnostic criteria in 1980, but fast forward, it sort of changes, okay? That men will only be diagnosed with PTSD in relation to war, nothing else, okay? And I agree with Martin that we don't have much written about PTSD in relation to men as victims. And of course the issue also begins with I guess the shame, the humiliation, and I guess also the sense that one has lost his manhood. And then the other point that I want to make around men and trauma is the fact that obviously when it comes to, and I'll give you a practical example. We did a study now around house robberies, where obviously perpetrators are there, everyone is in the house, and in fact a lot of men who found themselves in such situations, none of them were willing to seek trauma counseling. The main worry was about the well-being of their families, the well-being of their kids, the well-being of their partners.
These are the victims of the burglaries.
Yes, sure. And when we try to sort of check individually now, and it's later. So obviously also there is a delayed reaction. To say, okay, now I can see everyone is fine. I need to find my own moment. So the advice that I normally give is that with men you don't need to intervene immediately. Given all the things that we've said about the construction of masculinity, even with police officers, even with the work that I'm doing currently in Marikana,
first responders as well.
Yeah, they don't. You need to wait and wait. And when you wait, few years later, it's when some are more willing, to sort of talk. And I guess, we've delayed, but this point, to say we need to get to a point where we humanize, men. We humanize, men, to say you don't need to suffer in silence. You need to come to the fore. And once we recognize that you don't need to play this protective role of saying, because also with burglaries, there's a sense of one has failed, to be the head of the family, because at that moment everyone was helpless, everyone was sort of powerless. So all the ingredients of what it means to be a man were taken away at that time. You're embarrassed, you're humiliated in the eyes of your kids, in the eyes of
Your wife. Yeah.
Just to latch onto that, Doctor, is male victimhood seen to be less of an issue or less important than female victimhood? And is that how our society has been dispositioned, for lack of a better word? As far as I'm thinking of instances, just as Martin was referring to earlier, where a man walks into or steps into a space to report.
The reaction is not the same. And both for, even now, there's a big study that we are currently doing on SGBV, okay? And then in the questionnaire, it's around sexual and gender-based violence. And then we're asking participants, Are you aware of services? And what services are you aware of in your community? And what are some of the reasons you're not making use of these services? And I sort of insisted, as part of trying to answer, I guess, some of Martin's comments. Are you not going to that clinic, because there are no male doctors? Are you not going to that clinic because there are no non-binary people, or people that are non-gender conforming? Okay? And of course, with a lot of men that we're interviewing, many of them are saying it would be better. It would be better if I were to go there, because we know in a lot of clinics you find female nurses. Okay? And if this is the reason that we're being given, I guess at a policy level, will we get to a point where we begin to have such places being staffed with male, let's say male nurses, male doctors, male psychologists, and so on and so forth. Okay? But then it talks to some of these professions. Because in this country, how many men trainers nurses? Yeah. How many men trainers? And again, it's about those sort of misconceptions. Right. So for me, ultimately, is that we can go far as the Domestic Violence Act of 1998, okay? And it has been amended and amended and amended. We have so many policies. It's 2022. We are still sitting here and having this conversation. Yeah. And then it's when will this come to an end? I'm of the view to say we have spoken and we have spoken and we have spoken. We are rehearsing answers that we've been giving and giving and giving and giving and giving. But the problem sort of continues.
Does that lend itself to the issue around having this conversation with like-minded people versus trying to have this exact same conversation with those who might not be initiated, those who might not be aware of the state of the problem that we're facing, and how do we bridge those gaps of communication?
I think, obviously, I'd not want to give a very long-winded answer. But, there's a paper that I've written with colleagues where we're saying in South Africa, we know what are the causes of violence. We know them in and out. So in that paper, we argue that we have reached a cul-de-sac, and obviously the conclusion that we reach in that paper is around what we call a second wave. And obviously it was before the wave of COVID, a second wave of violence, sort of scholarship. Yeah. And basically what we are saying in there is that the risk factors, we know them very well. And hence all policies get made based on risk factors, but not on the subject, sort of itself. The subject itself, meaning ayanda, to say, and obviously I'll speak as a psychologist. Psychologically, what does it mean to be ayanda? And if then we're true, the enactment and the reenactment of what it means to be this subject that he is, and try and spend time, to say, ayanda, the moments where you get angry. And when you're angry as Ayanda, and I know then people then say, no, but now you're psychologizing, the problem. But I'm saying what we've been doing is very sociological, okay? It's more political. It's in terms of factors and factors and factors. But all these factors do not dent any change, in terms of the subject. Hence, I then went back, to say, let me spend time with the same group of people. And I see it even with, and of course, there's that luxury, of course, with my patients.
Yes, controlled environment.
Yeah. Where I'm seeing this guy, it's on one-to-one, he comes for the session today, he comes for next week, he comes the week after, and there are those that have been seeing for 3 to 4 years. Of course, in terms of the frequency, it changes as we go along, okay? And I see where we would have started, where now the guy, there's this appreciation of saying, look, there are moments where the center is not holding. And there are moments where the center holds. There are moments where I lose temper. There are moments where I realize my own misogynist, despite the fact that I see myself as being quite progressive. There are moments where I catch myself making sexist jokes. There are moments, and then the subject continues to sort of reflect. It is not a moment of saying, we are now marching to union building. And then for that moment, I have this awareness. And then there's no Tsagofatso Pule who has been killed.
Right.
And then we all go back to our laurels. And then we are waiting for another
Major.
what I call a public spectacle.
Right.
Sort of moment.
And we're speaking now in a context where the news cycle is not necessarily talking about gender-based violence or anything like that. And I wonder whether or not, for instance, dare I even say, broadcasters would make space for something like this outside of that outrage, as it were. Because sometimes that's where the criticism lies. We go through these iterations of anger. Perhaps your guys' phones are ringing off the hook, producers wanting you on their shows. And when it dies, we sort of move on,
It's over.
Right. And perhaps that's kind of where we need to begin if we want to move the conversation forward, right? How do we keep, at the very least, the interest alive? Because the problems don't go away just because it's no longer on the news, just because it's no longer on the front pages.
Just because it's no longer a priority.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah. We need to, let's not talk about the press because they're probably the most guilty of the entire bunch, right? Because the minute there's an abusive act against a woman, boy, the press is on its front page news, it's on every news station, it's everywhere, and it carries on, I'm busy dealing with a case in Pietermaritzburg where there was a pedophile who he posed as a school counselor. He was a psychologist who worked as a school counselor, had access to these boys, and we know that he raped 9 boys repeatedly over several years. Okay, probably more. We don't know about them. The press coverage of that particular case, you'd think here's a serial rapist, child rapist, who got off for 500 Rand bail, okay, was only covered by the local newspaper in Maritzburg. How sad. And as much as I try to draw attention to all the major newspapers in the country, weren't interested. We had to have like a Parktown Boys, suddenly, wow, major thing, Parktown Boys. Now we're suddenly talking about it. And because of the exposure on that Parktown Boys cases was handled within a year, right? Maritzburg case, 6 years. 6 years. We finally got judgment, and we have to wait another 4 months till July to get sentencing. And the guy, he's guilty, but he's allowed to walk free. It just doesn't make sense to me. So we as activists need the press to buy into this. We as activists need the press to tell our stories. My organization's just run a thing called the Nkunzi Project. And we've featured 10 men who've told their stories about being raped as children or being abused, etc., etc. We had over 1 million people view those stories. This to me is sort of an interest story that the press should be picking up on and put in that, because when one man tells his story, he gives another man permission to start talking about it. And I can tell you something, that the lives that have been transformed through this are incredible.
Right.
I've watched men physically change, not just mentally change, physically change before my eyes in a year-long program that we run. That is worth it, and if we could get more men into this, then we can be changing individuals, but we need to be running the same programs for parents, teaching them how to parent. We need to be running the same programs for teachers so that they can be empathetic to victims that they obviously spot in their classes.
You mentioned something very interesting in that, which ties into something that you mentioned near the top of our discussion, as far as how these issues seem to be focused squarely, or should I say more so on women than the men who are also equally impacted by these issues of sexual violence, sexual assault, and rape and the like, and how that discrepancy between the volume at which women report these issues versus the volume at which men report these issues is informed by little instances like what you mentioned about what you saw in the clinic when you walked in, and the various ways in which men are discouraged to share their stories. A component of that I've found is down to whenever things like stats and research is brought up about how men and boys are impacted by these issues. A lot of the response to that becomes, oh no, but we're talking about the women now. Yes. If the men and women are going through this, they must talk about that by themselves. Is that symptomatic of an issue that's being faced? Where again, it ties back to a question I think I posed earlier, where men and boys' victimhood is viewed to be less important than women's victimhood, and how do we go about addressing that to open a space where everyone, regardless of which side of the gender divide they're on, are able to share these stories that they need to share?
Well, I think we need to start changing perceptions. How do we start changing? I mean, I was talking to Yanda earlier where I said to him, do a quick Google search on images about gender-based violence, images about sexual violence or sexual abuse. When you look at those images, I can guarantee you 100% of them will be about girls, the pictures. So the image that we're portraying to society is that it's only girls, you know? And I always call them the hairy fist posters. So you'll see the hairy fist in the front and the girl cowering or the woman cowering with the blue eye and that sort of stuff. Pushing this message that only women are victims and only men are perpetrators. When we know, and we're starting to find out more and more, that this isn't true, right? Research is starting to emerge from the UK, from Australia, from America, that in fact, between 40 and 52% of men are violently being abused in their homes. You know, so that means there are female perpetrators. But, you know, again, society tells us that women are all nurturing and loving and caring. You know, we all love our children, you know. Not true. You know, we are just portraying the wrong images. We're talking about the wrong things. We're making it a gender issue when it's a human problem. You know what I mean? Why is it that if a boy grows up in a physically violent home, that he's the one that grows up to be the perpetrator, yet his sister is going to be like a wonderful,
virtuous
human being who's not angry at the world? You know, she's also going to be angry. She would also probably start displaying signs or traits of violence against those closest to her. Right. And this is the insidious nature of abuse, is that it actually impacts on those that you love the most. I mean, I have the men come in and talk to me, and they're always saying this: why am I always angry with those that I love the most? I always hurt the ones I love the most, the ones that are closest to me. And they hate it. I mean, they just don't want to be who they are. They just don't understand why they're like that. So how do we change this? We need to start changing the way that we portray abuse. Right. You know, and gender-based violence and all that sort of
stuff. Got you. We need to somehow find a way of rounding our conversation down. But perhaps as we do that, Dr. Langa, how do we get to a point where the binary of good and bad isn't so stark when we think about who the victims and perpetrators are? Because if Martin's own experience, your work is anything to go by, we know it's not that simple. Even for the most atrocious of perpetrators, you know, people who many would say lock them up and throw away the key. Somewhere in there lies a victim of some other system, you know. And I wonder whether the Academy of Research...
That's what we call the polymorphy or the polymorphous nature of violence. And I guess I've gone back to the paper, you know, to say, I think we've tried to distinguish different forms of violence as if they can be differentiated. In fact, they overlap, and hence we say they're polymorphous. They can be differentiated. But the way out, I guess, for me, because obviously at some point in this conversation, you're like, look, the media and this and this and this, the headline, and things sort of disappear. I'm not a very social media person, but I was talking to a colleague, Professor Kopano Ratele, and he said, look, Malose, we have no choice. I know you're very busy, but when time allows, let's also invade these spaces. If there's a podcast that has been made, and when time allows, make time. Go and deliver a brief sort of message. And of course, obviously, this podcast is going to be seen, I suspect, by a lot of people.
And heard by more.
And heard by a lot of people. And it is through that where now and then you get a call from like someone say, hey, I saw this like podcast like somewhere, and I saw so and so speaking about this. Are you able to be of any help like to me? Okay, so obviously, I mean, there's a role that conversations such as this can sort of like play, and I've seen the positive role that conversation of this like nature sort of like play. But my last parting shot is that all of us have a duty. All of us have a duty to make change that we all wish to see. We all have a duty. As we're sitting here, it is not only the four of us in this like studio. There'll be people that will be editing this. There are people that are taking like pictures. There's my sister there. In a way, if you're to calculate how many are we in this like room, we are about like 12. But people that are good in numbers is that out of 12 people, it means we are like 120. And then you can imagine 120 out of this like conversation, how many people are able to sort of like reach through this. I believe that we are going to touch so many like people. So for me, it is an honor to have been invited. I mean, to be part of this like panel.
Melissa, there's a lot of talk, even mostly, I guess, in predominantly Black communities about the effectiveness or lack thereof of something like counseling therapy. You work in that space, and I imagine it's a foregone conclusion that you find it very effective. The reality, though, is that isn't a sentiment that resonates with a lot of people. And so in that world, I mean, how do we begin creating spaces, avenues, channels for people to reap the benefits of something like therapy without necessarily sitting in front of a therapist?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, we need to acknowledge we come a long way, a long way. That in my private work, if I were to, I mean, I've been doing this work since 2002. Comparatively, if I count, like, how many male patients I've seen, during that, period, in my early phases of my career, it would be very, very few men. And then fast forward, and then I say from 2015 till to date, the number has grown substantially. And here I'm talking about black men has grown substantially. And of course that can be attributed to the awareness, but we still need to grow the number. The number we still need to grow. So we have had cases around mental health, mental health, and normally it would be as a result of, I guess, well-known individuals having committed suicide. And I know immediately after that, one is going to be inundated with a lot of calls, a lot of, can you comment on this? Can you comment on this? And again, there will be this talk about mental health and mental health. And of course, men respond, to that call to say, I no longer need to keep quiet. But then the question remains, where do I go? Okay? So there are a lot of men that wish, as a result of the awareness that we are raising, this podcast is going to raise awareness. At the end of it, people need to know. We'll talk about healing. And someone will say, okay, where do I go? The fact is that there are no services out there. Public services, it means if you need to go and see a psychologist, you need to go to Bara. But also to go to Bara, there's a red tape. You need to go to the clinic first. And as a result of that, already it's I don't have to go through that, pain of having to negotiate, so much, red tape. So for me, it's a challenge that we need. I think the point that I want to make is that awareness is slowly growing, but we need to grow it more.
Yes.
But once it has been grown, where do people go? Because the fact is that A lot of psychologists are working in private practice. And for you to access such a service, you need to have a medical aid. Given the high rate of unemployment, how many men are going to afford that? So the least that we need to do, okay? I was in Deep Slot last week, and it was prior the whole Dudula operation, movement. I've been doing a lot of work with young men, of course, through soccer, okay? So what I've realized is that a lot of young men, the only way to catch them is to go to spaces where they are. So they play soccer, we go there, it's a tournament, but also then I meet with coaches because I'll not be there like that all the time. I meet with the coaches, to say, hey coach, do you know what is ADHD? And then I do workshops on ADHD. I do workshops on trauma that Martin spoke about. You as a soccer coach, if you see a child behaving in this way, you need to find ways of sitting down with this child. And then if you're struggling, then you can call me. That's the least that you can do. And we have people that are willing to provide such community interventions. But of course, they need resources as well. They need the resources. I need a space because now it's no longer one boy who wants to see me. Even with the notes that I take, where do I put them? Confidentiality, where do I write up all these notes? Again, for me, it's about commitment, because I go there, it's not someone is paying me to do that. It's a commitment that I've made to myself, to say, this is the least that I'm able to do. Then you can imagine if all of us were to be committed, to say, as I am, I'll adopt 3 or 4 boys that I know. That now and then I'll check on them, and I'll keep on checking on them. And if then they present with something that I'm not able to assist, I can call on Malose. And it's where we make use of networks. Like Malose, look, I have this chap, and I see so many people on pro bono. I have this chap, is in crisis. Are you able to assist? And I have also other networks that I rely on. So in brief, yeah.
Now,
Sorry.
Doctor, you mentioned healing, and I'm going to latch onto that because that segues neatly into the question I'd like to pose to the both of you, where it seems to be we agree on how essential it is to pursue healing, and we also seem to be in agreement that there are not enough channels available for the men, in particular, in need of this healing to access this healing. So just to expound on this theme of healing, I think for you, Martin, I'd like for you to talk us through, being that you had to heal from something traumatic in your own life and your own life experience. Could you talk us through what healing as an idea and what that healing looked and felt like for you? And I guess for you, Doctor, being that you work with various men that talk through all sorts of issues with you as far as their own experience is concerned, in you trying to help them find this healing, what does healing look like for men, and how does that clash with how healing is supposed to feel and resonate to those in pursuit of it?
Well, from my perspective, healing went from wanting to die most of the time, 5 suicide attempts before I was 24, 25, to a point where I could walk in and occupy a space. I'm confident in who I am. I'm confident in my masculinity. I'm confident as a husband. I'm confident as a father. I'm confident as an activist. I'm confident as a person. I'm comfortable in my own skin for the first time. And that only happened in my 40s. I started dealing with this when I was 45. It took me 2 to 3 years of intensive work. And then in 2011, I started Matrix Men, and I started telling my story in the hope. And so many men are afraid to come in and talk about that. But the freedom that you gain when you start dealing with it is amazing. It's something that you can't put a monetary value to. It's just no way to explain how it is to go from being suicidal and depressed most of your life to being happy and confident and able Yeah. That to me was the journey in a nutshell. Yeah.
Sure. Final take, Doc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Martin explained it very well. Because for me, healing it is when one is able to speak about the unspoken. Like when a person is something that I was keeping to myself, and freely now I'm able to talk about it. And then I become free of this burden, free of this stress, free of this depression. But the other thing that I need to caution is that it doesn't end, to say.
No, it's an ongoing process.
It's ongoing,
Yeah,
and ongoing
definitely.
and ongoing. And I think that's what we need to emphasize. But once we've done the dirty work of starting, the later phases, hence even the frequency, it's once in a while. In the clients that I see twice a year, thrice a year. And at the beginning, it was weekly and weekly and weekly and weekly. And we touch base, all is still well. I'm dealing with this, but it's not a major, no stress.
Martin, as far as the exercise of seeking therapy is concerned, I'd like to talk, and I think you'd be best positioned to answer this, being that you are a white man, or someone who identifies as a white man. This idea that therapy is for white people, that seems to emerge as an answer whenever black men are confronted with the need to access therapy. They go, oh no, but that's a white people thing. Is there any insight you can give to us as far as the racial demographic that is apparently at play in terms of which of the race divide chooses to access therapy between white men and black men, and how do we go about addressing the discrepancies if there are any to address?
Yeah. Definitely there is a racial thing, so a cultural problem, let's call it that, right? So I find the most people that come in for support are Afrikaans males, believe it or not. And I kind of, thinking about it, I can only hypothesize, is that Afrikaners have kind of ruled the roost for so many years, and all of a sudden they were shown to be wrong in every aspect of their belief, I think. And they're, I think, the most willing to change. The most willing to evolve, right? The next would be English white guys, and then, strangely enough, black people would be the next sort of major proportion of our members. Coloreds, 0. Indians, a few. So if you're going to take the worst in terms of race, the colored people are the ones that don't want to talk about this. The next would be Indians, and then blacks, English, Afrikaans. We can even break it down to not just a white-black thing. And I think a lot of it is a cultural aspect. When talking to colored people and asking them why they don't want to come through and help, and they say because the communities are so small that if you do go for therapy, somebody will find out about it, and then the whole community will know about it, and you'll be mocked for it. So they're afraid to come in terms of that aspect. The Indian community, again, quite a small community, and you'd be deemed to be weak if you had to come in for therapy and that sort of thing. But men in general, we're not given permission to seek help.
Right.
And one of our drives was to make it woke for men to come for therapy. We opened a center where we could have we offered free support to men. Our numbers in 8 months escalated hugely. We used to on average have 3-4 new men into the groups and the sessions every month. In 8 months we got another 73 men in to come for help, and that was purely through social media. But we had to close down, unfortunately, because we're willing to spend 11 billion rand a year on fixing broken women, but not a cent on fixing broken men, and that's very sad. So the center's closed. So we're drawing back, we're seeking funding, and hopefully we'll be able to open those spaces that you were talking about in every major city. And when I say major city, I'm talking Soweto, I'm talking Johannesburg, I'm talking Alexander, I'm talking Tembisa, I'm talking, around the country. We want to create those safe spaces like a man cave where men can come in and talk about the issues. Not, instead of the shebeen, let's go to this space and seek that therapy. You know, it doesn't have to be that blatant. It just needs to be 10 people talking about the issues that they suffer. You know, my wife is beating me, and you're not going to get laughed at because you're in the shebeen. You know, people are actually going to empathize with you and say, I understand, you know, how can we help you? Those are the sorts of spaces that we need to create.
Sure. Absolutely. And hopefully this is the beginning of some kind of journey too. Thank you so much for coming through and I guess giving of yourself in such a generous way, Martin and Malose. I really do appreciate it. Look, we were never going to solve all the problems around what it means to be a man in this context, especially when you consider, you know, things that aren't necessarily spoken about in this way. But as I always say, we've started the conversation. Hopefully you'll be able to take it forward. Thanks for watching and listening.